a big mouth, but not that big. So, today we're going to have a discussion, in terms of about the economy, markets, and a lot of people have been concerned the past month in general. I mean, and hopefully we can, have some discussion around that today. So, to start out, Steve, a lot of people, you hear about low unemployment and the economy is great in the U.S. What's your view of the U.S. economy today and going forward?
Certainly our economics team thinks that we're continuing to grow at a moderate pace. I think they, like most of the median surveys we have seen, show a bit of a cresting over the next 18 months or so, whether it's the overall GDP level or even some of the components. Today, the Fed met, and in their statement, they changed their wording to describe the pace of private business investment from growing to weakening slightly. And we see the same trend. So I think there's no fear. There's no fear of a recession. We've just hit a bear market officially in crude oil. That's a tax on consumers, which is not probably going to happen for a while. So I would say growth remains moderate. Let's define that as somewhere between 2 and 3%. I think it's difficult to grow faster than that because of some deep-seated issues we have with productivity and demographics, but 2 to 3% is okay. 3.7% unemployment is very good. We're starting to see the unemployment trends percolate into the hardest to employ workers. The headline unemployment rate is 3.7. The unemployment rate for part-time workers and workers working part-time because they can't get a full-time job is still 7.5. So it's double. And so when people wondered why Janet Yellen wasn't raising rates fast enough, and all of the models that people were using would have implied rates should have been a lot higher a lot sooner, she was looking at those broader trends in the employment picture beyond the headline number that you see on the front page of the paper the first Friday of every month.
When we look at employment, what about, Verizon's laying off significant numbers right now? How does that calculate in the employment numbers if you're 60 years of age and have the ability to retire? Do they count in those numbers?
Yeah, they count. The cohort that they pay attention to is 27 to 54. That's called the prime working age. But I think that may now change, and they're going to have to pay a lot more attention to the next demographic above 54. It does bring out a question that, you feel like even though it's 3.7%, it's the lowest it's been since before the year 2000, there still seems to be anxiety, and I think it's because of other things happening, things like automation, use of robots, pension issues, things like that, I think are making people still a little bit leery of just trusting too much, even though the headline numbers would tell you that you should be very complacent. People don't want to be complacent. That's probably a good thing.
Tax cuts happened at the beginning of the year, and a lot of, we know the impact this year to earnings. They're going to be more robust, right, because of the tax cuts. But as we go forward, how is it going to impact earnings of corporations, the tax cuts that we had this year?
There are an enormous number of moving parts, whether it's for consumers, whether it's for my 31-year-old son who's not going to buy a house because of the change in the SALT tax, and others like him. But on the corporate side, this is a very complex problem, especially if it's got a multinational dimension to it, because the number of cross currents that occur between what you can take for depreciation, bringing revenue back to be taxed at a different rate here versus leaving it overseas, whether you're coerced to do that or because of other things, increasing the pace that you can depreciate equipment. The corporate side of things is much more complicated than just saying, okay, we dropped the rate from 35 to 21. That, as you said, was what we saw first because people gave out bonuses, one-time special awards. You know, people made a big deal of hiring a bunch of workers, and, you know, JP Morgan is going to build 100 branches in 30 states that they've never been in, all that sort of stuff. So that was year one, but I think it's the next couple of years where it's going to be the fine print in the tax law, you know, pages 10 through 1,000 rather than the first 10 pages that are going to tell the tale on what happens in 2019 and 2020.
Yeah, I think even now the IRS is clarifying many things in our tax department. You know, be it deductibility of certain situations, they're just clarifying it right now. And I think there'll be much more clarification as we go forward. So, you know, as clients, we'll keep you notified as the changes or the definitions come out of certain situations. That's a problem when you have people write tax code. It's how do you define it? You know, okay, we're going to give you this, but really, what does that mean? And that's what they're doing now, is defining a lot of it. How do you think the tax cuts will impact individuals in terms of their spending as we go forward? I was at a meeting recently, and, you know, accountant, attorney, economist felt that there would be impact next year from individuals with some of their tax refunds from some of the tax cuts.
You know, again, it's almost a version of the corporate dilemma. I'm not sure if we totally know, you know, between, you know, everyone is so different. When you read an article in the paper, like the Times did over the weekend, in the Upshot column, which is, I think, a pretty good middle-of-the-road kind of benchmark on what's going on, and they analyzed a couple of taxpayers and looked at tax cuts, and they looked at changing things like salt, whatever else, and come up with $150, $175 a month more in a paycheck. But that's a median thing, and it's, you know, people are on vastly different paths on both sides of that. So again, I think people feel like they're getting some money back, but they're a little bit afraid to spend it because they're not sure about some of the other things, just like the corporations, things that take a little bit longer to seep in, but could have a bigger impact, like what happens to mortgage deductions, and we want to sell the house in northern New Jersey, very high tax part of the state, part of the country. So there's a lot of moving parts there. I would actually say, if people are thinking about how they feel about just their spending power and what's going on, the barometer I always use is gasoline above or below $4? And when it's above $4, the headwind in the economy grows dramatically. So I would almost be paying attention to energy prices, what's happening with crude, how are those dynamics growing, because if there's any one number that makes people sit up and think about how much they have to spend, it's filling the car with gas.
No, I'll agree with that. I mean, just, you know, recently I passed by the gas station and gas prices are dropping. You know, 20, 25 cents. Even New Jersey's had 2 tax increases for gasoline, where I'm seeing them lower than I've seen them in almost a year. You know, in terms of the Fed, back to the Fed, Paul, Mike, myself, and John, you know, last week Janet Yellen spoke at the Schwab meeting we're at. You know, and really, our clients really want to know, how does the Fed policy impact, before you answer that question, impact the investors? Anybody here ever have a 10% mortgage? Raise your hand. Come on, I know there's more of you. I have
14%.
Yeah. So I just want to put things in perspective before he answers the question. I remember my second mortgage was 9 5/8, and I was super excited.
Certainly housing prices, you know, given that's the way Americans have traditionally kind of financed their, you know, personal gain in wealth, was what they lived in, and they flipped it and moved a few times and got those one-time deductions. So certainly as they, you know, in the slow and steady pace that they've raised rates, you know, floating rate mortgage costs have gone up, you know, $200 or $300 a month now for the last couple of years, and that's something that people have to take into account. But at the same time, like I said, other things like energy prices have come down. So, you know, there's a trade-off there. There's a great graph I can send you, which has about 20 prices since 1990, and which of them have gone above or below the actual CPI. And, you know, the thing that I think makes people a little bit concerned is that things, housing, education, and healthcare have all dramatically increased above that median CPI. Cost of a TV has fallen 95%. So you've got an enormous difference between the cost of different things, and it kind of depends on each family's situation is what are they spending money on, and do they feel squeezed or not?
Yeah, healthcare has been a challenge. I mean, you know, when you look at Medicare costs over the years in terms of the increases, it's been exponential. And individual healthcare costs that almost, just one comment on healthcare. Anybody know what an Advantage plan is? Be very, very careful. Recently, I've heard from 2 clients where a major hospital, a major hospital will not take the Advantage plan as a supplement. So be very, very careful if you can choose the less, the less expensive Advantage plan, because it could compromise your care. So really think hard about what plan you choose, just an aside.
Drug prices. The administration's proposals certainly are a starting point, and they certainly demand an awful lot of attention. People should, I think, do their best to educate themselves about the pros and cons of the development cost versus the price you pay for the pill. There's an awful lot of discussion about wealth creation versus wealth extraction. You want the former, you don't want the latter. And the latter is the unnamed company that buys the patent and then raises the price from $400 to $4,000. That's wealth extraction. There was no wealth created there. There was just wealth extracted.
Very good point. So in terms of trade, we hear almost on a daily basis discussion of, the U.S. in terms of the trade situation, with, be it with Mexico and Canada, which has resolved, or, South Korea, which was resolved. And, we've resolved a lot of trade treaties with many countries. And the big one that's open is China. And what's your opinion on that moving forward, getting settled in the near future?
Well, first I get to tell my anecdote, which is the steel company in northern Pennsylvania that makes the human-sized tubes for compressed gas. And they were buying their pipe pre-cut, custom cut from a Chinese supplier because they were getting much better customer service than the U.S. supplier who would sell them a 100-foot length of pipe and just tell them to go cut it themselves. And it's kind of this generation's version of the GM car versus the Toyota in 1970. And the first shipment of pipe that they took from the Port of Philadelphia in March cost them an extra $165,000 to move out of the port. And that's a number on a page. That's irrelevant until you find out that that was worth 2 weeks' payroll. So that's real. And multiply that across the economy. And that's where the price increases that ripple into the supply chain that can then affect consumers to a greater or lesser degree. So again, how you're affected by trade kind of depends on what you're buying. If you are buying several cases of Coke a week, it might cost you $5 more because it's 1 or 2 cents a can because of the aluminum tariff or whatever else went on. If you haven't bought a washing machine in a while, and you go to the store to pick up one of those, you could be paying a couple $100s more. So, like a lot of these things, it's where am I in my life cycle? Where are my kids? What am I spending my money on? The 2 houses next to each other could have totally different opinions about that topic. Kind of depends on where they are. But the administration, for all the criticism about various ways that they've communicated with either people in the U.S. or other countries, clearly diagnosed a couple of, President Trump diagnosed and then wasn't afraid to talk about several things that have been festering for a long time, let's call it 20 years. First is globalization and the fact that there's cons as well as pros. And again, that depends on what company you work for, what product they make, a lot of other things. So that's the broadest kind of thing that was diagnosed. And then specifically China and what our relationship should be with China. The problem that I then see is that having diagnosed the problem and recognizing that when the Chinese show up in a town in Ohio in a particular industry, it's kind of like the corporate version of a swarm of locusts that just show up, and the leaves on the tree go away with the locusts. In this case, the jobs go away. So clearly they didn't play by the rules. The WTO expected them to become what we call in economics a market economy versus a non-market economy. Hasn't really happened. But the question is, now that you've diagnosed this and raised this from the rooftops and screamed it from the rooftops, how do you try and fix it? What's the prescription? And unfortunately, doing away with things like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or things like the Paris Accords, were a framework whereby you could have solved these problems. So we've understood the problem, we've raised the issue, now we have to do the hard part, which is to figure out a way to exist with this country of over 1 billion people, who's jostling with us now for global supremacy. And I think that the jury is still way out. There was an old phrase made about Japan, which is that Japan got rich before it got old. Japan's demographics are the most dire of all the G10 countries in terms of how old its population is and the cost of that on the social security system. People wonder, will China be able to get rich before it gets old? And that's a dilemma that their one-child policy has exacerbated. So they have issues. They're a command economy. When ZTE was banned by President Trump from accessing the US telecoms markets in March, and they rang up debts of $10 billion, the Chinese simply went to 4 of the large state-owned banks and told them how much each of them was going to lend to ZTE. President Trump could not go to JP Morgan, Bank of America, and Citibank and tell them how much they were going to lend to General Motors. That would not happen.
No. So do you think that we'll come to an agreement in the near term?
I think that there'll be some agreement on at least parts of the trade issue. I think that the tariffs, which actually have spiked in terms of the customs duties that we now bring in to a measurable amount, I think there are currents of what I was just reading that U.S. Special Trade Representative, having been breathing fire for 1.5 years, is now kind of toned down his rhetoric and is looking to figure out ways to come to a deal. And he is the hawk, the biggest hawk of all. So I think there's some movement to try and do some deals.
Okay, great. And what about?
By the way, just one quick thought. There are no bigger trade hawks in Washington than many Democrats. So don't think that just because we now have a split government that all of a sudden the doves of trade are going to rule, because the biggest China hawk before President Trump called them the grand champion currency manipulator was Democratic Senator Schumer.
Now, the rest of the international markets, this has been a challenging year for international in general because of the dollar strength against all the foreign currencies. How do you look at international markets going forward in terms of the outlook?
In terms of the emerging markets, there's, so we're talking Latin America and different parts of Africa, there's been some pretty dramatic political upheavals in various countries, which have knocked some of the economies off the rails, and has led to some significant currency weakness in places like South Africa and Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, Russia. On the G10 side, the developed market side, I suppose the 2 issues that I'm probably worried the most about, we were talking about at dinner, is Brexit And what does that mean for companies in the financial sector and in the corporate sector to supply chains? They're going to be ripped apart. And then the other one I would worry about, because it could have enormous currency implications, is Italy. Because Italy is a core member of the EU and the currency, and there is no easy exit. When they formed the euro in 1999, they expressly declined to include any provisions in the treaty that laid out a roadmap to leave the euro. It's as if they went on an island and then burned the bridge. So that issue is an existential one, and I think that has significant power to disrupt. If I was an investor overseas, and again, we were talking about this before, outside the other room, you know, you buy foreign companies because you want exposure to different kinds of markets moving at different speeds than your own. Maybe there's different technologies, different, product areas, but you don't necessarily want the noise that comes with the currency fluctuation. So theoretically, that means that people should be thinking about buying a portfolio or investing in a portfolio, whether they're individuals or whether they're corporations themselves, and eliminating the currency noise with whatever structures they construct around the portfolio. Because, South Africa is a perfect example. They have an election in April coming up. It's going to be bloody. It just is. And there are some world-class companies in South Africa. So as a case study, you like the company, but you don't like the currency. You have to have your eyes wide open for 6 months of volatility, and then when you move through the other side, you get to calmer waters after moving through the rapids and the river. So, things like that are what I would say you need to pay attention to. Do you like the overall structure of the economy? Do you like the structure of the company? And do you see noise that could kind of muddy the waters? Jim Cramer, for all of his bluster, has a very good line, which is when he's being asked a question about a company, or a company that may be having some rough times, he'll say to the person on the phone, is it a broken stock or is it a broken company?
Okay. October was a very volatile month. I mean, if you take the last 2 days out of it, it was probably one of the worst months since '09, March of '09. How do you feel volatility will be going forward in the next couple of years?
We've had a lot of these 6 week to 1 month kind of volatility scares. We had this one, we had March, we had July, August of 15 and January of 16 that were generated by some botched financial market machinations in China. And it's always come back, right? We have a measure of financial market conditions that tracks a lot of temperature gauges, if you will, of financial health. What are the spreads between junk bonds and treasuries? What are the spreads between euro dollars and T-bills? And in the face of 8 Fed increases, that index is at near its most benign level since the Fed started raising rates.
That's excellent.
So it's, indicators can be proven wrong, but it's kind of instructive that in the face of the cycle that we're seeing relatively benign conditions. I would just be a little bit concerned about the crisis that we don't see around the corner. What's coming. Like I mentioned a few things like Italy and China, and could there be a student loan problem? Could there be a subprime auto loan problem? Something that makes people nervous about the financial system. I mean, those things are kind of always there. If you go back and look at a chart of Fed funds increases as instituted by the Greenspan Fed in the early 2000s, there were about 25 basis point rate increases. And every statement that the Fed issued had almost the same language in it, and then there was another tick up. And we know what happened in 08-09. So how is it possible that the Fed was theoretically trying to wring out the excesses in the financial market gradually over 4 or 5 years and somehow missed whatever happened in the fall of 2008? The comment I would make is markets sometimes need to have a little fear. And they were not afraid of the Greenspan Fed. They factored in those rate increases into their fancy algorithms and decided they could stay in those triple levered CLOs and CDOs. And then, we finally had a tipping point. So I would say volatility stays relatively controlled. Again, I go back to energy. Energy is so important that if you have problems in that sector that start to seep into other sectors, that's when the volatility that comes for a month stays longer.
Excellent. With the election that we just had, we're only a couple days past, and I was reading in the paper, that the average return was 16.67 the following 12 months after the election, which sounds exciting, right? But remember, the past does not always guarantee the future. What's your opinion on going forward in terms of this being now a balanced Congress?
Right.
And, now we're going forward after the election, midterm election. And
there's an awful lot of discussion, obviously, about the non-policy machinations that might take place now that the House is controlled by the other party. But leaving that part out, I think you have to distinguish between two things. Once you have a majority plus one in any house, you have operational control, right? You control the committees, you control the subpoena power, you control what witnesses to call, all of that, the agenda, you control. But you don't necessarily have legislative control. I would really distinguish between operational control and legislative control. This is not the UK or Germany in a parliamentary system where when you get one past 50%, you run things and your party, every last one of them votes with you all the time. As you all know, that's not how we run things here. So the fact that Nancy Pelosi has an 8-seat majority, I don't consider that a majority, other than the fact that she can pick the committee chairman, decide who to subpoena, and embarrass mightily various cabinet secretaries, which I'm sure she will. The only question is how far they decide to take that. But whether it means you can all of a sudden come up with a list of 10 bills that you want to pass, and magically they pass, I think there's a long way to go before we get to there. And I think that the Congress has, if there's two things that you'd like to see happen in the next 2 years, it would be drug prices, maybe slash some healthcare solution, and infrastructure. And because I think the last one, for anyone that's driven on roads in this part of the state, it doesn't matter what party you're in, you just want to fix them.
And how do you feel that will impact, this being post-midterm elections, the markets?
Well, that Fed's on the cards for another 1% over the next, let's call it 12 months. If we get to 2020, we think rates will be 1% higher than where they are now. So factor that into the math of, whatever you're looking at on the rate side and what that means for other interest rates like CDs or mortgages, things like that. On the equity side, again, it's a bit more than that. It's the confluence of trade, the confluence of healthcare, the confluence of infrastructure, those other policy type developments that have a chance to impact things. And I think that, I guess I wouldn't see any reason why we don't just kind of percolate, and nothing ever moves one way all the time, right? There's always back and forth. But it wouldn't seem like there's any reason to be worried. Corporates have a lot of cash in the U.S. So I don't think there's an issue. I'll come back to how many times have I mentioned crude oil? Again, you get over $4 a barrel, the Dow and the S&P look different. So in the U.S., that's kind of the thought. The one thing I would be a little concerned about and be wary of is what debt levels corporations in the emerging markets hold. In the 90s and the 80s, governments in Mexico and Brazil and South Africa and Russia borrowed enormous amounts of dollars because they were seduced by the low interest rates. And then got crushed when the Fed started sucking liquidity out of the system. The governments in those countries have learned their lesson and have a lot of dollar debt now, or just have surpluses. They don't come to the market. But where there are some ticking time bombs are the really large state-owned companies in Brazil, in Indonesia, in Turkey, in Russia, in South Africa, whose debt levels rival countries and whose importance in the local economy makes them almost like a sovereign. So if Petrobras in Brazil defaults, it's kind of like Brazil defaulting. So I would just be, eyes wide open about emerging market portfolios, because I think some of those companies have amassed enormous amounts of debt. And the Fed raising rates, don't forget, sucks liquidity out of not just New Jersey, but Brazil.
All right. Well, we want to thank you so much for everything this evening and all your insights. Are we going to have any questions or
No, we don't have time.
questions?
If you,
So we're going to just want to make one comment. Even though we've sent out communications regarding this, if you're over 70 and a half, please call us if you make charitable contributions. You can make it from your minimum distribution. By making it, charitable contributions may not be deductible for you if you don't file your schedules. If you just take the standard deduction, it's not deductible. So by having it come out of your minimum distribution, and it could be 52 checks in a year, it's not a problem. Make the checks out for your church or synagogue for a weekly service. So that's very important, because we have clients that are getting $4,000 or $5,000 of technically deductions because their 1099 will be less based on their charitable contributions. So, please contact us if you're making charitable contributions and you're over 70 and a half. You should have it come out of your minimum distribution. And again, we want to thank everybody for the time this evening.